The capture of Captain Elias Stone. General Crixella stood tall in the command chamber of her warship, her piercing eyes scanning the holographic map of the galaxy. Every star system she had conquered gleamed with a crimson glow, marking her empire's dominance. She was a legend among her people, a fearless leader who inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure. To her, emotions like doubt and mercy were signs of weakness, and she had no patience for them. But tonight, something unusual had happened. "Bring him in," Crixella commanded, her voice cold and commanding. Two of her guards entered, dragging a prisoner between them. The human, though bound and bruised, held his head high. His dark eyes locked on Crixella's without a hint of fear. This unsettled her, though she didn't let it show. "Captain Elias Stone," she said, her tone sharp. "You are the leader of the resistance force that dared to attack my fleet. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Elias smirked, the kind of smirk that ignited curiosity and irritation at once. "Only that you underestimated us," he replied, typical of someone who rules through fear. The room fell silent. No one spoke to Crixella like that. Not her enemies, not even her closest advisors. She stepped closer, towering over Elias. Yet, instead of cowering, he remained calm, as if he held a secret that gave him strength. "Underestimated," Crixella echoed, her voice dangerously low. "Your fleet was destroyed. Your forces are scattered. And now, you are my prisoner. What is there to underestimate?" Elias shrugged as much as his restraints allowed. "You look at us and see weakness. But humans thrive in adversity. You'll see soon enough." His words hung in the air, refusing to fade like smoke. Crixella felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, curiosity. This human didn't behave like others she had captured. Most begged for their lives or hurled insults, trying to mask their fear. But Elias showed neither. Instead, he acted as though he had already won some unseen battle. "Put him in the holding cell," Crixella ordered, her tone as sharp as ever. "I'll deal with him later." The guards dragged Elias away, but his smirk lingered in Crixella's mind like an itch she couldn't scratch. Hours later, Crixella found herself standing outside the cell where Elias was held. The ship hummed softly around her, its vast corridors empty at this late hour. She told herself she was here to ensure the prisoner wasn't plotting anything. Yet, deep down, she knew the truth. She couldn't stop thinking about his words. Inside the cell, Elias sat on the cold floor, his back against the wall, looking relaxed despite his situation. When he saw Crixella, he raised an eyebrow. "Couldn't sleep." Crixella ignored the taunt. "You're surprisingly calm for a man who might not live to see tomorrow." Elias tilted his head. "Fear is a choice, and I choose not to be afraid." "Is that supposed to impress me?" she asked, stepping closer. The barrier between them glowed faintly, a reminder of her authority. "It's not about impressing you," Elias replied, his tone casual but firm. "It's about understanding. Your empire thinks fear is power, but fear only works until someone refuses to be controlled by it." Crixella frowned. His words were simple, yet they carried weight. And what do humans believe in then? Resilience, unity, hope. Elias said without hesitation. "You see us as fragile because we don't have your technology or your numbers. But what we have is far more dangerous, the will to fight for each other." Crixella studied him, her mind racing. For the first time in years, she felt a sliver of doubt. Could there be truth in his words? She quickly pushed the thought away. Doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You speak as though you've already won," she said, her voice steady. "But your people are losing this war." "For now," Elias admitted. "But wars aren't just about battles. They're about hearts and minds. And you've already started to lose yours, haven't you?" Crixella stiffened. "What are you implying?" Elias leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You wouldn't be here if I hadn't made you think. Something I said struck a nerve, didn't it?" She wanted to deny it, to lash out and remind him who was in control. But instead, She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. Back in her quarters, Crixella stared at the stars outside the viewport. She couldn't shake the feeling that Elias was right. His defiance, his confidence, it was unlike anything she had encountered. And worse, it was starting to make her question her own empire's methods. Resilience, unity, hope, she muttered under her breath. The words felt foreign, almost absurd, yet they lingered in her mind, refusing to be dismissed. For the first time in her life, General Crixella felt a crack in the armor of her certainty, and she hated it. But she couldn't stop herself from wondering, could there be another way? Seeds of doubt. The warship's interior was a maze of cold metal corridors and harsh lights, its vastness designed to intimidate. Yet, for the first time in years, General Crixella felt something she hadn't in a long while, a flicker of uncertainty. In her private quarters, the holographic map of her conquests glimmered before her, each captured system a testament to her empire's might. She studied it, but her focus wasn't on the victories. Instead, her thoughts kept drifting back to the human prisoner. His words were annoyingly persistent, like a melody she couldn't forget. Crixella dismissed the display with a wave of her hand and leaned back in her chair. Elias Stone wasn't just a soldier. He was something else, an enigma. Humans were supposed to break easily, yet he seemed unshakable. Her comm device chimed. "General, we've detected unusual activity near the Raltar sector," one of her officers reported. "It may be the humans attempting to regroup. Send a scout fleet to investigate." Crixella replied automatically. But her mind wasn't on the sector. It was still on Elias. Why had he spoken to her as if she were the one on trial? His calm defiance wasn't just confidence, it was conviction. She needed answers. Elias sat cross-legged in his cell, humming a soft tune. The faint glow of the energy barrier cast long shadows on his face, but he didn't seem to mind. His eyes were sharp, always watching, always calculating. When Crixella entered, he didn't look surprised. "Back so soon. I'm starting to think you enjoy my company." "You think highly of yourself," she said coolly. "I'm here for answers." "Answers?" Elias leaned back against the wall, his expression thoughtful. "Funny. That's what I thought you wanted when you captured me. But it seems like I'm the one asking the real questions now." Crixella's jaw tightened. "Enough riddles. Why do you fight for a losing cause?" Elias chuckled softly. "Is it really losing if the fight inspires others? If it forces someone like you to question everything?" She stiffened. "I question nothing. Don't you?" Elias's voice dropped, his tone serious now. "You're here, aren't you? Visiting a prisoner in the middle of the night. That doesn't strike me as the actions of someone entirely certain of their path." Crixella's hand instinctively went to her weapon, but she didn't draw it. Instead, she stepped closer to the barrier, her voice low and sharp. "You assume too much, human. And you assume too little," Elias countered. "You think your empire is invincible because it rules through fear. But fear is fragile. It cracks under pressure. You've seen it yourself, haven't you? Soldiers who obey orders but resent you. Advisors who smile to your face but whisper behind your back." The words hit harder than she expected. Crixella's grip tightened. "You don't know anything about my empire." "I know enough," Elias said, his eyes steady. "And I know something about you too. You're not like them. You're smarter, stronger, but you're also tired." The statement hung in the air. Crixella hated how true it felt. She had spent years leading conquest after conquest, silencing dissent, crushing rebellion. But in the quiet moments, when the battles were over and the stars stretched endlessly before her, she often felt the weight of it all. "I am not tired," she said finally, her voice cold. "I am focused, and you will answer my questions." Elias smiled faintly. "Then ask." Crixella hesitated. "Why do you believe humans can win this war?" Elias's smile widened, but it wasn't smug. It was the kind of smile that hinted at something deeper. "Because we don't fight alone." She frowned. Your forces are scattered. You're isolated. What allies do you speak of? Elias leaned forward, his gaze intense. Not allies. Beliefs. Humans don't fight for empires or power. We fight for each other. For family, for freedom. That's what makes us dangerous. You can crush a fleet, but you can't crush an idea. Crixella stared at him, her mind racing. The words shouldn't have meant anything to her. They were just human idealism, naive and futile. Yet they stirred something within her, something she couldn't name. She stepped back, her expression unreadable. You speak as though your beliefs make you invincible. They don't make us invincible, Elias admitted, but they make us unbreakable. As Crixella left the cell, her thoughts swirled like a storm. Elias had planted a seed of doubt, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't uproot it. Back on the command deck, her officers awaited her orders. General, one of them said cautiously, shall we prepare for the next offensive? Crixella nodded, her voice steady. Proceed as planned. But as she watched the holographic display of the galaxy once more, the red markers of her empire's conquests seemed different. They no longer looked like symbols of strength. Instead, they reminded her of something Elias had said. Fear is fragile. For the first time, General Crixella found herself wondering if her empire's foundation was as solid as she had always believed, or if it was already beginning to crack. An unlikely alliance. Crixella stood on the observation deck of her flagship, staring at the swirling stars outside the viewport. The vastness of space usually gave her comfort, a sense of control over the infinite chaos. But tonight, it offered no solace. Elias Stone's words lingered in her mind like a haunting melody. She wanted to dismiss him as another arrogant human, but something about his confidence unnerved her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Commander Velix, her most trusted advisor, entered, his expression grim. General, there has been an incident, he said. Our scouts in the Raltar sector have gone silent. We suspect a human ambush. Crixella turned sharply. An ambush. That sector was under full control. Velix hesitated. It seems the humans are more resourceful than we anticipated. Crixella's eyes narrowed. Assemble the fleet. I will not let them embarrass us. Of course, General, Velix replied, but his tone carried a hint of doubt. As he left, Crixella couldn't ignore the unease creeping into her ranks. Fear was supposed to be her weapon, but now it seemed to be infecting her own people. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to find them. Elias Stone was pacing in his cell when Crixella arrived. He stopped and turned to face her, his expression calm, almost amused. Back again, he asked. I'm starting to think you enjoy these little chats. Spare me your wit, Crixella snapped. My fleet has encountered resistance in the Raltar sector. What do you know about it? Elias leaned casually against the wall. I might know something, but why should I tell you? Crixella's patience was wearing thin. Because if you don't, I will ensure your people suffer the consequences. Elias raised an eyebrow. Empty threats don't suit you, General. You're smarter than that. She stepped closer to the energy barrier separating them. You underestimate me, human. No, Elias said, his voice softer now. I see you for what you are. A leader caught between two worlds, one of fear and one of hope. The question is, which one will you choose? Crixella froze. The word struck a nerve she hadn't realized was exposed. She quickly masked her reaction with a scowl. You speak as though I have a choice. You always have a choice, Elias replied. You just don't want to admit it. For a long moment, neither spoke. The tension in the room was thick, but it wasn't hostile. It was something else, something that felt strangely like understanding. Finally, Crixella broke the silence. If I release you, can you guarantee your people will stand down? Elias smiled faintly. You don't strike me as someone who makes deals. I don't, she said sharply. But I also don't waste opportunities. You could be useful. Useful, Elias repeated, his tone thoughtful. Interesting choice of words. All right, General. I'll cooperate, but on one condition. Crixella raised an eyebrow. You're not in a position to negotiate. And yet here I am, Elias said, his smirk returning. If you want my help, I need to know you're willing to listen. Really listen. Crixella hesitated. This was a dangerous game. Trusting a human, especially one as cunning as Elias, could undermine everything she had built. But something in his eyes made her pause. It wasn't arrogance or defiance. It was something she couldn't quite place. Reluctantly, she nodded. Very well. But if you betray me, I will destroy your people without hesitation. Fair enough, Elias said. Now let's talk about Raltar. Hours later, Crixella sat in the war room with Elias, his restraints replaced with a tracking collar. The other officers looked on in shock and disbelief, but Crixella silenced their objections with a single glare. Elias studied the holographic map of the Raltar sector. Your forces rely too much on predictable routes, he said. The humans have likely set up traps here and here. He pointed to 2 unassuming asteroid belts. If you send your fleet in blind, you'll walk right into an ambush. And what do you suggest? Crixella asked, her tone skeptical but curious. Divide your forces, Elias said. Send a decoy fleet through the obvious route to draw them out. Meanwhile, your main fleet can flank them from the shadow side of the nearest moon. Crixella frowned. That's risky. So is doing nothing, Elias countered. But if you want to win, you need to adapt. Humans don't fight fair, General. We fight smart. Crixella studied the map, her mind racing. Elias's plan was unorthodox, but it made sense. More importantly, it was something her own advisors would never have considered. Very well, she said finally. We'll do it your way. Elias smiled. Good choice. The operation unfolded exactly as Elias predicted. The human ambush was lured out by the decoy fleet, and Crixella's main forces struck from the shadows, crushing the resistance in the sector. It was a decisive victory, but it didn't feel like one. Back on the flagship, Crixella confronted Elias. Your plan worked, but I still don't trust you. I wouldn't expect you to, Elias said. Trust isn't built overnight, but you trusted me enough to listen. That's a start. Crixella didn't respond. She turned and left the room, her thoughts swirling. Elias had proven his value, but his influence was growing, and for the first time, Crixella wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a dangerous one. The betrayal within. The air aboard Crixella's flagship was thick with tension. The victory in the Raltar sector had temporarily silenced dissent among her officers, but the undercurrents of unease remained. Crixella could feel it, the subtle glances exchanged between her commanders, the hushed conversations that ceased whenever she entered the room. Trust was a fragile thing aboard her ship, and Elias Stone's presence had made it even more precarious. In the command chamber, Crixella stood before the holographic galaxy map, her hands clasped behind her back. Elias was nearby, studying the same display. His sharp eyes moved quickly, his mind already working on strategies she hadn't considered. You've been quiet, she said without looking at him. I'm just admiring the view, Elias replied, his tone light. Your empire's reach is impressive, I'll admit, but it's like a house of cards, strong until someone pulls the wrong piece. Crixella's gaze flicked to him, her expression hard. And you think humans are that piece? Not think, Elias corrected. No. Before Crixella could respond, Commander Velix entered the chamber, his expression as cold as steel. He shot a glance at Elias, his disdain evident, before addressing Crixella. General, may I speak with you privately? Elias smirked. I'll take that as my cue to leave. He gestured to the guards near the entrance. Escort me back to my cell, gentlemen. As Elias left, Velix turned to Crixella, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. General, I must speak plainly. This arrangement with the human prisoner is causing unrest among the officers. Many believe you've compromised the Empire's principles. Compromised? Crixella's voice was sharp. "Do you question my judgment, Commander?" "I would never, General," Velix said quickly, "but others might. They see your reliance on this human as a sign of weakness." Crixella's eyes narrowed. "And what do you see?" Velix hesitated. "I see a leader who has always been decisive and unwavering. I only ask that you consider the loyalty of your crew. If doubt spreads, it could lead to instability." Crixella stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for your concern, Commander. That will be all." Velix saluted stiffly and left the chamber, but Crixella's mind was already racing. The cracks in her command were growing wider. She had built her empire on fear and obedience, but now those same tools seemed to be turning against her. Later that night, Crixella summoned Elias to a secure briefing room. He entered with his usual air of confidence, despite the restraints around his wrists. "You called, General?" he asked, leaning casually against the table. "You've been a disruptive influence," Crixella said bluntly. "My officers are questioning my decisions because of you." Elias shrugged. "Change makes people uncomfortable, but maybe that's a good thing." "Is it?" Crixella countered, her voice sharp. "Because if this unrest escalates, it could lead to mutiny. And if that happens, neither of us will survive." Elias's smirk faded. He straightened, his tone turning serious. "Then you need to act before they do." "And what would you suggest, human?" Crixella asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Trust works both ways," Elias said. "If you want your officers to trust you, show them you're still the leader they fear and respect. But don't stop there. Show them that fear isn't the only way to lead." Crixella frowned. "You think I should abandon everything that has made me successful?" "No," Elias replied. "I think you should adapt. Fear can control people, but respect can inspire them. Use both, and you'll be unstoppable." The words resonated with Crixella, though she hated to admit it. Elias had a way of cutting through her defenses, planting ideas she couldn't ignore. But before she could respond, an alarm blared through the ship. "General Crixella, report to the bridge immediately." A voice called over the comms. "There's been a breach in the lower decks." Crixella's eyes narrowed. "Stay here," she ordered Elias as she stormed out of the room, flanked by guards. On the bridge, chaos reigned. Commander Velix was already there, barking orders as reports poured in. "What happened?" Crixella demanded. "Sabotage," Velix said grimly. "Explosives were planted near the reactor core. We've contained the damage, but it was close." Crixella's jaw tightened. "Do we know who's responsible?" "Not yet," Velix admitted. "But the timing is suspicious." Crixella didn't miss the implication. "You think Elias is behind this?" "He's the most likely suspect," Velix said. "His presence here has already caused unrest. This could be his way of escalating it." Crixella's mind raced. The idea seemed plausible, but something didn't sit right. Elias had nothing to gain from sabotage, at least, not yet. "I'll deal with him personally," she said, her tone icy. Back in the briefing room, Crixella found Elias sitting calmly, as if he hadn't heard the alarms. "Trouble in paradise?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. "Don't play games with me," Crixella snapped. "There's been an attack on my ship, and you're the prime suspect." Elias raised an eyebrow. "That's convenient. Who benefits from making me look guilty?" Crixella froze. The question cut through her anger, forcing her to consider the possibility. Velix's warnings, the sabotage, the growing unrest, it all pointed to something larger than Elias. "Your people aren't your only enemies, General," Elias said, his voice softer now. "You've built an empire on fear. Don't be surprised when someone tries to use that fear against you." Crixella stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. If there was a traitor among her crew, it meant her empire's greatest threat wasn't the humans, it was her own people. And for the first time, Crixella realized she might need Elias's help more than she wanted to admit. shadows within. The flagship's once sterile corridors now buzzed with unease. Crixella strode through the halls, her expression a mask of icy determination, though her mind churned with questions. The sabotage was an act of defiance from within, a challenge to her authority that threatened the stability of everything she had built. It wasn't just about Elias anymore. Someone among her own crew was plotting against her. Elias Stone followed her at a controlled pace, his tracking collar glowing faintly. He hadn't been sent back to his cell by Crixella's command, but instead was accompanying her to the war room. Her officers were less than pleased. "You're taking a risk," Elias murmured, his tone quiet enough to keep the guards from hearing. Crixella shot him a glance. "And you're enjoying it." "Not enjoying it," Elias corrected. "Just curious. Mutiny doesn't happen overnight. Someone's been planting seeds for a while." "You speak as though you've seen this before," she said sharply. Elias's smirk returned. "Humans have a knack for rebellion. It's in our DNA." Crixella didn't respond. She didn't need to. The tension in the air was enough to remind them both that this rebellion, if left unchecked, could destroy her. The war room was alive with holographic displays and the clipped voices of officers coordinating damage control. Commander Velix stood at the head of the table, his expression grave as he outlined the extent of the sabotage. "The explosives were placed with precision," Velix said. "Whoever did this knew the ship's schematics intimately. It had to be an inside job." "Do you have suspects?" Crixella asked, her voice sharp. Velix hesitated. "There are several officers with questionable loyalty, but nothing concrete yet." Crixella's gaze shifted to Elias, who was watching the exchange with quiet interest. "And what does the human think?" The room fell silent. Velix's jaw tightened, his disapproval evident. "General, with all due respect." "This is my ship, Commander," Crixella interrupted, her tone icy. "If I want the human's opinion, I will have it." Elias stepped forward, his eyes scanning the holographic map of the sabotage sites. "Whoever did this had access to your systems and knew your routines. This wasn't a lone wolf, it was coordinated." Velix scoffed. "And what makes you such an expert?" "Because I've done it before," Elias replied, his voice calm. "Infiltrating enemy ships, dismantling their systems from within. It's standard resistance tactics. But this is bigger. It's not just sabotage, it's a message." Crixella's eyes narrowed. "A message to whom?" "To you," Elias said simply. "Your people are afraid of you, but they're also watching you. If someone's challenging your authority, they want to see how you'll respond. If you crack down too hard, you'll confirm their fears and push more of them toward rebellion. But if you don't act, they'll see you as weak." Velix bristled. "We don't need his advice, General." Crixella ignored him, her focus on Elias. "And what would you suggest?" Elias smiled faintly. "Find the leader. Sabotage like this doesn't happen without someone pulling the strings. And when you find them, don't just punish them. Make an example of them." Hours later, Crixella sat in her quarters, reviewing reports on her officers. Her trusted crew was now a web of potential traitors, each name on the list a possible conspirator. The strain was palpable, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her empire's foundations shifting beneath her. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. The doors slid open, and Elias entered, flanked by guards. "I hope this is important," she said, not looking up from the reports. "It is," Elias replied. "I've been thinking about your sabotage problem." Crixella raised an eyebrow. "And you're looking for someone who's smart, connected, and ambitious," Elias said. "Someone who doesn't just want to destroy your empire. They want to replace you." She frowned. "And you think you can identify them?" "I already have a theory," Elias said, stepping closer. "But you're not going to like it." "Speak," Crixella commanded. Elias glanced at the guards. "What I'm about to say isn't for everyone's ears." Crixella hesitated, then nodded to the guards. "Leave us." Once the door slid shut, Elias leaned against the table, his tone dropping. "Your commander, Velix. He's the one you need to watch." Crixella's eyes narrowed. "Velix has been loyal for years." "Loyalty shifts when fear outweighs respect," Elias said. "Think about it. He's been vocal about his concerns over your decisions. He's rallied other officers against the idea of working with me. And he's positioned himself as your right hand, close enough to influence others, but distant enough to avoid suspicion." The accusation stung, but Crixella couldn't ignore the logic. Velix had been more confrontational lately, more vocal in his disagreements, and his knowledge of the ship's systems made him a prime candidate for the sabotage. "Do you have proof?" she asked. "Not yet," Elias admitted, "but give me access to your internal systems, and I can find it." Crixella stiffened. "You expect me to hand over control of my ship to a human?" "Not control," Elias said. "Just enough access to trace communications, monitor movements, and see who's been where they shouldn't be. If I'm wrong, you can throw me back in the brig or out an airlock. Your call." Crixella stared at him, weighing the risk, trusting Elias was dangerous, but ignoring his insight could be fatal. "Fine," she said finally. "But if you betray me, I won't wait for an airlock." Elias smirked. "Noted." By the end of the day, Elias had uncovered a series of encrypted communications linking Velix to suspicious activity in the lower decks. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to confirm Crixella's worst fears. That night, as Crixella prepared for the confrontation ahead, she realized how far she had already fallen from the leader she once was. She had always believed in the strength of fear, but now she was learning just how fragile it could be. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she could rebuild what had been broken. The enemy within. The air on Crixella's flagship had turned suffocating. Every step Crixella took felt heavier. Every glance from her crew waited with unspoken questions. It wasn't fear she saw in their eyes anymore. It was doubt. The fear had cracked, and through the fractures seeped something more dangerous. Defiance. Elias's findings couldn't be ignored. The encrypted communications he had traced led directly to Commander Velix's private terminals. Crixella had ordered a discreet surveillance team to confirm her suspicions, and the results were damning. Velix wasn't just conspiring, he was orchestrating. Now, standing on the bridge, Crixella gazed at the holographic starfield before her, a storm of emotions churning beneath her calm exterior. Elias stood nearby, his tracking collar still glowing, though his posture suggested anything but captivity. He watched the crew with the same sharpness he had displayed since his capture, as if studying them for weaknesses or alliances. "This is the part where you act," Elias said quietly, stepping closer. "Hesitation will cost you." Crixella turned her icy gaze to him. "I do not hesitate." "Really?" Elias gestured subtly to the officers at their posts, each one casting nervous glances at her. "Because it looks like they're waiting to see if their leader is still in control." Her jaw tightened. He wasn't wrong, and she hated that he wasn't wrong. She turned to the communications officer, summoned Commander Velix to the strategy room. "Now." The officer hesitated only briefly before complying. Crixella didn't miss the flicker of fear in his expression. It was a reminder of what had kept her empire together for so long, and what was now threatening to tear it apart. The strategy room was quiet, its walls lined with glowing tactical displays. Crixella stood at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on the door. Elias leaned against a console nearby, a silent observer whose presence was both unsettling and strangely reassuring. The door hissed open, and Velix entered. His face was a perfect mask of professionalism, but Crixella saw the flicker of unease in his eyes when he noticed Elias. "You summoned me, General," Velix said, his tone measured. "I did," Crixella replied. "We've had a security breach. Sabotage in the lower decks. You're aware of this, of course." Velix nodded. "Yes, General. I've been overseeing the investigation personally." "How diligent of you," Crixella said, her voice sharp enough to cut steel. "And what have you found?" Velix hesitated, just for a moment. "The evidence is inconclusive, but I suspect the human prisoner's influence may be." "Enough," Crixella snapped, her voice echoing through the room. "The sabotage wasn't orchestrated by the human. It was orchestrated by you." Velix stiffened, his mask cracking. "General, that's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," Crixella said coldly. "It's a fact. The communications, the access logs, all of it points to you." Velix's eyes flicked to Elias, his expression darkening. "You're taking the word of a prisoner over your own people." "I'm taking the word of evidence," Crixella replied. "And the evidence is damning." For a moment, Velix was silent. Then his lips curled into a bitter smile. "So this is how it ends. Betrayed by the leader I served for years." "You didn't serve me," Crixella said, her voice low and dangerous. "You served yourself, and now you'll answer for it." Velix's hand moved in a blur, reaching for a concealed weapon. But Crixella was faster. Her blaster was in her hand before he could draw, and a single shot sent him crumpling to the floor. The room fell silent, the only sound the hum of the ship's systems. Crixella lowered her weapon, her face an unreadable mask. "That was decisive," Elias said finally, breaking the silence. Crixella turned to him, her voice cold. "You think I should have hesitated?" "Not at all," Elias said, his tone calm. "But now comes the hard part." "And what part is that?" she asked. "Convincing the rest of your crew that this wasn't just you consolidating power," Elias said. "Fear can keep them in line for now, but if you don't rebuild their trust, it'll only be a matter of time before someone else takes Velix's place." Crixella stared at him, her mind racing. He was right. Again. Killing Velix had been necessary, but it wasn't the end of the rebellion. It was only the beginning. Later, Crixella addressed her crew from the bridge, her voice steady and commanding. "Today we discovered a traitor in our midst. Commander Velix betrayed not only me but all of you. His actions endangered this ship, this mission, and the empire we've built together. He has been dealt with." She paused, letting her words sink in. The faces of her crew were a mix of fear and uncertainty. They needed more than punishment. They needed reassurance. "This ship is not just a weapon," Crixella continued. "It is a symbol of our strength and unity. If we allow doubt and fear to divide us, we will fall. But if we stand together, we are unstoppable." The crew murmured their agreement, though it was hesitant. Crixella knew it would take more than words to win them back. But for now, it was enough. As she stepped away from the command platform, Elias approached her, his voice low. "Not bad. A little heavy on the fear, but not bad." "Don't push your luck, human," Crixella said, though there was no real venom in her voice. Elias smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." For the first time in her life, Crixella felt the fragile balance of power shifting. Fear was no longer enough. If she wanted to hold her empire together, she would need something stronger, something she wasn't sure she even believed in. And that terrified her more than any enemy ever had. A leader reborn. The flagship was silent as Crixella stood on the observation deck, gazing out at the endless expanse of stars. The recent events had left their mark. Velix's betrayal, the crew's shaken trust, and her own growing doubts about the foundation of her empire. The stars, which once symbolized conquest, now seemed like scattered fragments of a fragile order. Behind her, Elias approached, his footsteps light. Despite his tracking collar, he carried himself with an ease that seemed to mock the tension surrounding them. "You're thinking about what comes next," Elias said, leaning casually against the viewport frame. "I don't need your observations, human," Crixella replied sharply, though her voice lacked its usual venom. "Maybe not," Elias said, his tone softening, "but I think you know I'm right. Killing Velix solved one problem, but it didn't fix the bigger one. Your empire is cracking, and you can't patch it with fear anymore." Crixella turned to face him, her expression a mixture of anger and resignation. "And what do you propose, Captain Stone? That I abandon everything I've built? That I rule with kindness and hope?" "Not kindness," Elias said, his gaze steady. "Respect. Trust. The kind of leadership that inspires people to fight for you, not just because they fear you, but because they believe in you." She scoffed. "Belief is a human weakness." "Belief," Elias countered, "is what has kept humanity alive against impossible odds. It's why I'm standing here, and why you're listening to me, even though you don't want to admit it." Crixella stared at him, her mind racing. She hated how much sense he made, how his words seemed to pierce the armor of certainty she had built over decades. But before she could respond, the ship's alarms blared, cutting through the silence. "General Crixella, report to the bridge immediately." A voice called over the comms. "We're under attack." The bridge was chaos when Crixella and Elias arrived. The crew scrambled to respond to a fleet of enemy ships that had appeared on the edge of the system. The ships weren't human. They were from one of the rival factions within her empire, emboldened by Velix's rebellion. "They're targeting our propulsion systems," one officer reported, panic evident in her voice. "If they disable us, we're dead in space." Crixella's eyes narrowed. She strode to the command platform, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Calm yourselves. Divert power to shields and prepare for countermeasures. They think we're vulnerable, and we will show them how wrong they are." The crew hesitated for only a moment before snapping into action, her commanding presence enough to rally them. But Crixella knew the battle ahead wasn't just about survival. It was about sending a message to her enemies and her crew alike. Elias stood nearby, observing the unfolding chaos. "They're testing you," he said quietly. "If you don't make a statement here, they'll keep coming." "I don't need your advice," Crixella snapped, though she felt a flicker of doubt. Could she hold her empire together through force alone? "You need to outthink them," Elias continued, unfazed. "They expect you to rely on brute strength, but you've got something better. Strategy." Crixella's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" Elias stepped closer, pointing to the holographic display of the battlefield. "These ships are fast but lightly armored. If you concentrate your fire on their flanking units, you'll force them into a bottleneck. Once they're clustered, you can hit them with a precision strike. It's risky, but it'll show them you're not to be underestimated." Crixella considered his plan, her mind racing. It was unconventional, but it made sense. And more importantly, it was the kind of bold move her enemies wouldn't expect. "Do it," she ordered. "Relay coordinates to the gunnery teams. Focus fire on the flanks and prepare for a concentrated strike." The crew moved quickly, their initial hesitation replaced with determination. Crixella watched as the enemy ships fell into the trap, their formation collapsing as her fleet struck with precision. One by one, the enemy ships were disabled or destroyed, their gamble to exploit her supposed weakness turning into their defeat. The bridge erupted in cheers as the final enemy ship was obliterated, but Crixella's expression remained stoic. She turned to her crew, her voice steady and commanding. "This victory is a reminder of who we are," she said. "We are strong not because of fear, but because of our unity. If we stand together, no enemy can defeat us." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, she saw something new in the eyes of her crew. It wasn't just fear, it was respect. Later, Crixella stood alone on the observation deck, the faint hum of the ship's systems the only sound. Elias joined her, his expression thoughtful. "Well," he said, breaking the silence, "that was impressive." "You sound surprised," Crixella replied, though her tone was lighter than usual. "I'm not," Elias said. "You're a quick learner. That speech at the end. Classic leadership move. You've got the crew eating out of your hand." Crixella smirked faintly. "Don't push your luck, human." Elias chuckled. "Wouldn't dream of it." They stood in silence for a moment, the vastness of space stretching out before them. For the first time, Crixella felt something she hadn't in years: hope. It was a fragile thing, unfamiliar and unwelcome, but it was there nonetheless. "You were right about one thing," she said finally. "Fear alone isn't enough, but don't mistake this for weakness." "Never," Elias replied, his tone serious. "Strength isn't about fear or control. It's about knowing when to change." Crixella didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and enemies she couldn't yet see. But for the first time, she felt ready to face it, not as the ruthless conqueror she had been, but as the leader she could become.